maybe slightly more than 1 second. There we go. Maybe next week or tonight or sometime I'll have it worked out where it's not all of that happening. My Bible is open up to Romans 1. We're going to be looking at a couple of verses there here in just a moment. And really, we're going to be spending the entire time right in Romans 1. We're going to be looking at verses 19 and 20. And we're going to be doing a lot of talking this morning. And I know as we get into several minutes of talking, you're going to start wondering, Colton, where's the Bible? Because we're getting into an apologetics lesson, and apologetics lessons always feel very strange to preach because as you're getting into arguments for God, the Bible assumes God. Certainly, there are a lot of passages that we can look at, like our scripture reading in Psalm 19 and verse 1, that the heavens declare the glory of God. The sky, the firmament declares it's his handiwork. The very creation proves his existence. We're going to see it here in just a second in Romans 1 and verses 19 and 20, that because creation exists, it shows us that God exists. We see it from the very beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. And there are a lot of people who don't believe that. There are a lot of people who are going to argue vehemently against that. And so I want us to take this and examine it and look that indeed creation does declare God's existence. As we begin to make this apologetic argument, the fancy word for this argument that because the universe exists, then God must exist. The fancy word is the cosmological argument. Typically, when I'm making apologetic arguments, I argue from design. The fancy word for that is the teleological argument, that because things are designed in such a way, it's very clear that there must be a designer. But we're taking a step back just before that argument, not really even going to get into design in this lesson. We'll just barely step into it in one point. But just because of the fact that this world and this universe exist, that it is, not even that it's well designed, and it is, but that it exists shows us that God must exist. As we work on this and think about this, I want to think about the Big Bang. Just for a moment, we're going to get into its history, but typically in an audience like this, when you say the word Big Bang, and not even an audience like this, I think typically when you say the word Big Bang, people think about evolution. They think about the world banging into existence out of that primordial ooze that somehow was there and exploded. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit. And that from that point, things over the millions and billions of years slowly evolved into what we have today. Can I suggest to you that the Big Bang doesn't teach that? That the Big Bang is actually proof for God. As we think about the world banging, or the universe rather, banging into existence, that there had to be something there to cause the bang. There had to be something there to bring these things into existence. As we work through the history of this, going back many, many years ago, scientists once believed that the universe was eternal, that it never came into existence, but rather it had always existed. In 1916, Einstein came up with his theory of general relativity. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and pretend like I know everything or even a whole lot about Einstein's general theory of relativity. But what this posits, or at least one part of what it posits, is that it requires a beginning to space, matter, and time. It puts forward that the universe has not always existed. It must have come into existence. Well, 3 years later, his theory is proven true. We're going to bring up in a little while, it's proven true to 5 decimal places. I don't know a whole lot about math and exactly all of the formulas that go into proving that this is true, but I hope we can recognize that with each decimal place you put behind that number, it gets finer and finer and finer, more and more and more precise. And this theory is proven true to 5 decimal places. And then as we come several more years forward into 1927, the universe is observed to be expanding. Now, this is something that Einstein theorized would happen. It's what his theory predicted to be true, and that being shown, being examined, being observed to expanding, shows that what his theory looked to being was true. And in its observation, it looks as though the universe is seemingly expanding from a singular point in the past. That in its place of origin, the universe begins, it bangs into existence, that Big Bang Theory, and that then from that place, the universe is expanding. And so as we look at this and we think about this, the fact that the universe does bang into existence, and I know we may have a distaste for using language like the Big Bang because of its association with evolution, but they've co-opted that. They've taken that away. In fact, Einstein, as he's putting all of these numbers together, he introduces what he called a fudge factor because he didn't like where these things were putting. The fact that the universe wasn't eternal, that it had to come into existence, means there must have been something to cause it to come into existence. And it ends up, after doing all the math, Einstein was dividing by 0 in his fudge factor, which you can't do. And so it gets taken out of the way. And so they've co-opted the Big Bang into their doctrine, into arguing for evolution. But really what it argues is the universe banging into existence. And as we work our way through talking about these things, in order for it to bang into existence, something has to cause the bang. Let's set up the logical argument. And the logical argument structure we're using is called a syllogism. And what a syllogism does is it takes 2 premises and it sets them forward. And technically, a syllogism can set forward a false premise and come to a conclusion, but it does not have to. If we can set forth 2 premises and prove that they are true, then the conclusion that is drawn from the premise is set forward as being true. The first premise is that everything that had a beginning had a cause. Something had to cause the beginning. In science, this is called the law of causality. And there are very few that are going to argue against the law of causality. You know the one exception to arguing against the law of causality in their mind? This argument. You start using this argument to argue for God, and it's, oh no, that can't be true. There are very few who are going to argue against the law of causality. Science is very, very careful about calling things a law. Really want to observe that it is set in place. The law of causality says everything that had a beginning had a cause behind its beginning. Second premise, the universe had a beginning. Now we're going to argue some further for this here in just a moment, but I think we can set that forward in Einstein's general theory of relativity, that it does posit and has been proven true and observed that the universe is not eternal, has not always been here. It had a beginning. And so if our first premise is true, everything that had a beginning had a cause, and the second premise is true, the universe had a beginning, that has to mean the universe had a cause. There must have been something to cause its beginning. As we work on this second premise, though, that the universe had a beginning, let's think about some evidences for this. And I'm working out of a material by some authors named Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. And for those of you wondering, they are not the apologist I was talking about on Wednesday evening, though they do talk about that particular apologist in this book. But I'm working in a lot of the material that they provide, and they spell out the word surge here as we are looking at these evidences that the universe did indeed have a beginning, and it is not eternal. It has not always existed. The S of surge is the second law of thermodynamics. Now, the first law of thermodynamics, maybe you can think back and remember in school that they taught you. The first law is that energy is neither created nor destroyed. And what we can see inside, if it is not created, if it is not destroyed, it is finite. No more energy is coming into existence. There are different forms of energy that are being changed into another form, but no more is coming into existence. It is finite. Now, the second law of thermodynamics says that energy is used. Sometimes it's referred to as the law of entropy. That is when things move from order to disorder, as things move from ordered energy into disordered energy. When I was in school, the example that my teacher liked to talk about, and boy, I was a fan of it. She said, that's why your room gets dirty. That's why your house gets dirty, that unless you put forward the energy that will translate into clean energy, then things just naturally move down. That's entropy. Now, as we observe our universe, as we observe our world, we can observe order. We can observe that the energy that is exerted in the world has not completely translated to disordered energy. Well, if energy is not created, if it's finite, and this world has been here eternally, and this universe has been here for all time, and we still have ordered energy, that energy's been used, then we would observe complete and total disorder, because all of that energy has not been used, because it cannot be used infinitely, and we still observe order in the universe. That tells us it had to have a beginning. It has not been here eternally. It has to have a set point in time in which it came into existence, since we can still observe that ordered energy. Secondly, we can see in universe expansion. Now, I mentioned this a moment ago that was observed a few years after Einstein's general theory of relativity, or theory of general relativity, that it was observed and it was seen that the universe is expanding. Now, this does a couple of things. One, it does demonstrate the explosion of the universe out of nothing. It is really interesting to me, and I will admit to you, this is something that, quite frankly, I've not completely wrapped my mind around. But as these gentlemen are discussing this, they say, now don't read this as the universe as it is just getting larger, but rather that in the expansion of the universe, you have areas where there's not universe, and then as it is expanding, there is universe there. And so that is certainly an interesting thing, but what we see is it demonstrates for us that there wasn't universe. It banged into existence and it is expanding. It demonstrates the explosion of the universe out of nothing. Then the R of surge is radiation from the Big Bang. And so as it was being thought about, Einstein's theory of relativity, they say if this is true, if everything's set forward, there must be radiation then that occurs from this. This was theorized as being true in 1948, and it was discovered quite by accident in 1965 as being true. A couple of guys were sitting there looking at their computer monitors, and they think something is messed up, and with their satellites, they go out and they clean them up. Maybe there are birds on it or something. And they go back and they look at their computers and this is still showing up. And they get to looking into it. And here it is. This is the radiation that was theorized those years ago. This radiation from the Big Bang. Once more, looking at the universe coming into existence. Then we come to the G, which is great galaxy seeds. Now, as I was reading this, I really thought they were just trying to get hokey and putting a G in there so that they could spell the word surge. But there was a writer who did refer to this as galaxy seeds. Perhaps they could have left the grade off to be a little less hokey. But nonetheless, what this is, it was discovered in 1992. These are ripples in that radiation that we just talked about, ripples in that radiation temperature in which galaxies are formed. Now, here's where we step into just a little bit concerning the design, concerning the order in the existence of this world. Geisler and Turek say the ripples show that the explosion and expansion of the universe was precisely tweaked to cause just enough matter to congregate to allow galaxy formation, but not enough to cause the universe to collapse back on itself. Any slight variation one way or the other, and none of us would be here to tell about it. In fact, the ripples are so exact, down to 1 part in 100,000, that Smoot called them the machining marks from the creation of the universe and the fingerprints of the maker. That precise. Any teeny tiny change to it, and the universe doesn't exist. Does not work, folds back on itself and just completely wipes itself out. That precise, you can see the maker's handiwork in that. Now what we saw in Psalm 19:1? You just look at the heavens and you can see God's hand at work. And then our final evidence that the universe did indeed have a beginning. We come back to Einstein's general theory of relativity that is verified, at least at the time of that writing. I don't know if that number has increased any, but that it has been verified to 5 decimal places that it is shown. The universe does indeed have a beginning. Let's take our minds back to our syllogism. Everything that has a beginning must have a cause. The universe has a beginning. The universe then must have a cause. A beginning does require a cause. For everything that exists, there are only two possibilities for its existence. which is where we come to an argument that is sometimes made as we talk about, yes, the universe must have had a beginning, and they know we're going to make the argument for God, and they say, what about God's beginning? Well, that's a misunderstanding of the law of causality. That's a misunderstanding of that which is set forward, because remember, we said that says everything that had a beginning must have a cause. But there's one other reason for something to exist. It could exist because it has always existed and therefore does not need a cause. God does not need a beginning. God is eternal. God has always existed. But the only other option is it was caused to exist by some force outside of itself. And so if the universe has a beginning, and that's where all the evidence points, it has to be caused to exist by some force outside of itself, which is where you reach the argument. Well, it did have a beginning like that. It's called the Big Bang and all of these things, and they just exploded into existence. There was nothing, there was this explosion, and then there was this something. Let's think about two things. One, if nothing explodes, what's left? Nothing. Nothing does not explode into something. Aristotle once said, nothing is what rocks dream of. And when they talk about nothing exploding, they're talking about there was this primordial ooze. There were these elements in the air at the time, and that's what exploded. Where'd the elements come from? Where did the primordial ooze that exploded come from? You can't have nothing explode into something. And if you have something that exploded, where did the something come from? Because if it's not eternal, something had to bring the something into existence, which is where we come to making this point. I want to quote from them once more. They quote from several agnostic scientists who really say that the universe's existence, its beginning, seems to point to the supernatural, and they have some way of weaseling their minds out of it. But after quoting from them, they make this point. Why couldn't natural forces have produced the universe? Because these scientists know as well as anyone that natural forces, indeed all of nature, were created at the Big Bang. In other words, the Big Bang was the beginning point for the entire physical universe. Time, space, and matter came into existence at that point. There was no natural world or natural law prior to the Big Bang. Since a cause cannot come after its effect, natural forces cannot account for the Big Bang. Therefore, there must be something outside of nature to do the job. That's exactly what the word supernatural means. There was no nature there to explode and become nature further. Something had to cause these things to come into existence, to then explode, and then set these things in order. That's Genesis 1 and 2, which brings us to another quote that I want of Mr. Geisler and Turk. In light of all the evidence for a beginning of the space-time universe, the beginner must be outside the space-time universe. He has always existed, does not need a cause for his existing, and then he is the cause for the universe existing. The very fact that we look around us and see the world that we do argues for God's existence, argues for his power, argues for his being God. He was the cause of the universe. As they are closing out this particular section, I forget if it's Mr. Geisler or Mr. Turk, but they said they were in a debate with an atheistic person, or at the very least an agnostic person, and they posed this question to them. If there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing? And they say, and I understand that I'm hearing this from one side, but they say upon that question, the one that they're debating says, that's a really good question. and then moved on. Did not address the question. But to quote from them once more, if there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing? Is a question we all have to answer. And in light of the evidence, we're left with only two options. Either no one created something out of nothing, or else someone created something out of nothing. Which view is more reasonable? Nothing created something? No. And if you can't believe that nothing caused something, then you don't have enough faith to be an atheist, which happens to be the name of the book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, because that's what you have to believe. There was nothing, because the universe isn't eternal, and nothing exploded, and then we have the universe. You have to believe that. Nothing made something. But I'll tell you what makes a whole lot more sense. Someone made something. I said we were going to get to Romans 1. It took us a little bit, but look with me. I have Romans 1:20 on the screen, but we will begin back in verse 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. The very fact that this world exists, the very fact that this universe exists has God's fingerprints all over it, that he exists, that he is. And we can put our faith in that. He's given us all the evidence that we need of that. There are plenty who want to make excuse, who want to deny God's existence despite the abundant evidence for it. And I'll tell you what, Romans 1 gets to the heart of that as well, where people begin to worship the creature rather than the creator. When people want to exalt themselves to the position of God and say that we get to set forth what we want, and there is no God over us who can tell us anything different, that's the heart of that. I want to put myself first. I worship myself, and so I have to deny God who would be able to tell me anything else. And we can't. Cannot deny God's existence. He has given us everything that we need to recognize that he does in fact exist. And the very fact of this world, when you look at its existence, notice what Paul tells us that shows us about him. It tells us of his eternal power. What power does it take that there is nothing and God says, I'm going to make this matter exist? Matter didn't exist and now it exists. What power does it take to then be able to take that formless, shapeless matter and give it form, give it function, give it purpose, give it design? What power is that? Eternal power. And it shows us his divine nature, because who else but God can do that? You cannot deny God. God exists. God is, and we have plenty of evidence for that. As I say, you cannot deny God. Certainly, I mean, you cannot deny his existence. He's given us all of the evidence for that. But the truth of the matter is you can deny God. You can say there is no God, and God's going to let you do that. He's given you all the evidence that you need to believe. But I don't think there's anyone here that says that. Everyone here recognizes there is a God. And if you don't, well, let's talk some more about some of this material. But I think everyone here recognizes there is a God. But you can deny him in another way. You can say that he has no power over your life. Where you follow after your own way, you live life in a way that's pleasing to you and reject his way. If that's you, you need to change that. You do need to recognize that he does exist, but don't end your recognition there. That is not the faith that pleases God. We know from Hebrews 11 and verse 6. The faith that pleases God indeed is the faith that recognizes he is. It is the faith that recognizes he exists, but it's also the faith that knows he is the rewarder of those who diligently seek him. If you're not diligently seeking God, you need to change that this morning. You need to turn away from the world and turn toward our God who created this world that we live in. If your sins have not been forgiven in baptism, won't you do that? Submit yourself to God. Be buried in that watery grave so that by his power you can be raised up to walk in newness of life. Or if you have, and you're not living in a way that's pleasing to him, repent. Turn away from your sins. Turn toward our God. Go to him in prayer for forgiveness and submit yourself to him. If there is anything at all this morning that we can do to help you with that, won't you come while we stand and sing the song selected?
God, come, yes, shall I go?